Hello, and thank you very much for joining me today. My name is Dan Perera. I'm a partner with HFW here in Singapore, specialising in international arbitration and major disputes in the energy and natural resources, including oil and gas, commodities and mining, project development and infrastructure, and construction sectors. I'm going to be speaking to you today on the topic of force majeure and COVID-19. Particularly looking back at the seminal question that we have been asked by many a client over the last 12 to 14 months. In particular, is COVID-19 a force majeure event? And I will look briefly to the future and to a particular issue which I anticipate may arise increasingly going forwards. So what is force majeure, or FM? Well, as I'm sure you're aware, it is a civil law concept providing relief to a party for its failure or inability to perform contractual obligations, which arises from circumstances which are usually beyond that party's control. Now, that's a concept, as I've mentioned, which arises under civil law. It is not a concept which is generally recognised at common law and in common law jurisdictions. The consequence of that is that it becomes a construct of contract. You will need to have an express force majeure clause within your contract in order for you to rely on it if your contract is governed by, for example, English law. So turning now to the question that we've been asked many times over the last 12 months, is COVID-19 a valid ground for declaring force majeure? Well, in summary, there is no simple answer to that question. It is a highly fact and circumstance specific issue which will require a great deal of analysis, certainly under common law such as English law. It may also be something which is highly industry specific, and I say that because particular industries have evolved so as to use particular standard form contracts, and those standard form contracts obviously have uniform clauses such as the force majeure provisions. It will therefore be a matter of industry standard practice in many cases as to whether or not force majeure will be applicable in the prevailing circumstances. Common piece of guidance here is that under English or other common law, you must look to the contract and its express terms, particularly the express terms of any force majeure provisions. Under English law, your right to rely on force majeure stems from the words of the FM clause alone, and it is those that you will need to have direct reference to when determining whether or not a particular circumstance may constitute an event of force majeure. Does your contract refer specifically, for example, to epidemics and pandemics as being a force majeure event? In some industries, this is incredibly rare. In other industries, including energy and resources, mining, oil and gas and commodities, this is not particularly uncommon, and those words are contained in a number of party, counterparty and industry standard form contracts. Even if your particular contract does not have provisions which deal expressly with pandemics and epidemics, consider whether your contract contains other catch-all wording which you may be able to rely on, such as any other circumstances beyond a party's control, which may permit you to declare force majeure and to avail yourself of the relief that the clause brings. In the energy and natural resources sector and oil and gas and commodities generally, it's much easier for a producer, a seller or supplier of product to declare force majeure because they generally bear the majority of risk in the production, in the transportation of the finished product to the delivery point, and to the sale of that product from the delivery point. A buyer's right to invoke force majeure is generally considerably more limited under those contracts, commonly because there needs to be a causal link between the issue which has occurred, the circumstances which are prevailing, and a party's ability to perform its contractual obligations. And when you consider standard sale and purchase documentation in the energy and resources and commodities world, you will generally find that a buyer's obligations under sale and purchase contracts are very limited. They are commonly limited to taking delivery of the product, which can give rise to some limited FM circumstances, and paying for the product. In most circumstances, payment of the product is excluded expressly as a potential force majeure event. So you would not generally be entitled to rely on force majeure just for reason of suffering financial hardship, for example. Most of the declarations that we've seen over the last 12 months or so from the buyer's side of the market are, in our opinion, invalid, save in respect of some very particular and narrow circumstances, whereas many of those on the seller or producer side have been considerably more robust in terms of their defensibility as force majeure events. What do we expect going forwards? Well, what we have seen is that many parties have continued to contract on the same unaltered industry standard terms, but without any specific reference to the ongoing global pandemic. The pandemic is not over. It's well known to parties, and contracting without some express reference to the ongoing circumstances now, without having a decent carve-out in place, could be putting you in a bit of trouble later on if, for any reason, you are unable to perform your contractual obligations as a result of COVID-related force majeure. While the foreseeability of a particular event and its circumstances is not always necessary to rely on a force majeure event, a party may find themselves unable to rely on COVID as a reason for declaring FM going forwards when they are aware of the global pandemic at the time of contracting, yet unequivocally promised to perform their obligations nonetheless, and with no distinct carve-outs for prevailing force majeure events. Again, this is general and will require a specific case-by-case analysis, but we do foresee issues arising in this space going forwards. Thank you very much indeed for your attention, kindly appreciated.